Okay, welcome back to our second roundtable discussion entitled Islamism, Liberalism and Democratic Theory, Lessons from Egypt's Failed Transition. The background to this panel and this discussion really, I think, has its origins in a series of comments that Mohammad Fadel was posting on the Sociology of Islam list server, which I'm a member and several other people are a member. It was around late 2012, early 2013, and I encouraged him to sort of write up his analysis. And one way of encouraging Mohammed to write up his analysis of what was happening in Egypt was to invite him to the University of Denver. And last September, approximately this time, we brought him here and he delivered a lecture on the broad topic of Islamism, liberalism, and democratic theory. And we encouraged him to write it up. And he did do that, and he published it, and we were able to sort of encourage the Boston Review to publish a special issue, a debate on Egypt's failed democratic transition, looking at questions of democratic theory, where Mohammad Fadel has the lead essay, and then there's a series of responses from several of the people who read the essay and commented on the essay. One of the people who commented on Mohammed's essay is our colleague here at Korbel, Micheline Ishay. When Mohammed spoke here last September, she was supposed to provide some comments, but due to a room scheduling problem, she, in the middle of providing her comments and her response to Mohammad Fadel, to which we were hoping he would have a chance of responding to, there was a class that was coming into the room, and so it was a very sort of rushed and chaotic sort of moment. And so all of that led to really where we are today. We thought we would try and reconvene what many of us at the Center for Middle East Studies thought was a very provocative and insightful sort of set of comments and arguments about Egypt's failed democratic transition from the perspective of democratic theory. So the format here is we're going to ask Mohammad Fadel to give us a short sort of 10-minute overview of his argument in his essay, and then we're going to ask Micheline Ishay from the Korbel School, Andrew March from Yale, and Dan Brumberg from USIP in Georgetown to sort of provide some comments. And similar to the earlier session, we will then broaden the conversation to the rest of the panel and then to the audience. So with that as a format, Mohammad, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nader, for this opportunity and this invitation to be with the good folks here and to see all my colleagues. So Nader, as he said, invited me to come talk to Denver, to come talk to the University of Denver, based on some of the things that, some of the missives I had posted to this listserv. And so I began to try to organize my thoughts, and the question essentially was whether normative political theory provides any kinds of insights into understanding the dynamics of political transition in Egypt, or what was going on in Egypt, whether we know how to transition or revolutionary, doesn't really matter from my perspective. Now, I want to qualify this by saying that even though I'm going to talk from the perspective of I talked about Egypt from the perspective of normative political theory, it's hardly the only angle which one could take or should take in thinking about the problems in Egypt. But having said that, I wanted to look at the Egyptian revolution from the perspective of normative political theory to try to assess, for lack of a better term, the rationality of the strategies pursued by, for lack of a better term, liberal Egyptian political activists. I put that between quotes because it's not quite clear to me the extent to which the liberal trend is really a significant factor in Egypt. But assuming that there was a liberal movement, and there certainly are some liberal politicians like Amr Hamzawi, I was interested in trying to understand whether their strategies post-resignation of Mubarak up until June 30th made any sort of sense from the perspective of political theory. And I also wanted to include a little bit of Islamic political theory because Egypt is obviously a Muslim majority state, and also the Muslim Brotherhood was an Islamist political movement. And so I felt that that was important as well. Now earlier, prior to the paper that I gave at Denver, I'd written a very short piece for another journal in which I talk about Islamic modernism as a context to understanding the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions. And one of the things I mentioned there was that, in my opinion, a successful transition to democracy could only proceed if the coalition between Islamists and liberals that I presumed existed during the 18 days of the Egyptian revolution lasted through the founding of a new kind of constitutional order. What happened on July 3rd signified that that failed. Right? And so in some ways, it's sort of a retroactive forensic examination of why it failed, whether there were good reasons for it to fail, or whether the liberal part of the coalition was unjustified in defecting. So I want to start with a 14th century Muslim thinker named Ibn Khaldun and his theory of the state, which was that in general you can talk about polities along three different broad categories of polities that are natural. They're based on sheer domination, that depend on a strong man to keep order, and people accede or people submit to the power of a strong man basically because there are no other alternatives to social peace. They're afraid of instability, they're afraid of violence from their neighbors, so to prevent that or to check that, they agree to submit themselves to the authority of the strong man. This natural dominion, however, suffers from the grave defect that it's inherently unstable because it depends on the virtue of the strong man or the dynasty, which inevitably decays over time. So Ibn Khaldun comes up with this theory about why states based on domination, mulk, only lasts, they have a very limited shelf life. Basically 3 generations, they fall apart, and then a new regime comes into place. However, he suggests that there are other kinds of regimes, one might call them more virtuous regimes, that in some respects can transcend the natural rise and decline of states. And those are either rational regimes based on philosophy or religious regimes based on revealed law. Now, the important point, though, that I take from Ibn Khaldun in this is that no state can dispense with mulk, the domination, that ultimately requires some kind of social basis of solidarity, which he calls asabiyya. In other words, what we would call constituencies, right? Any kind of state, a virtuous state as well as a non-virtuous state, has to rely on some kind of powerful social constituency. So he has this famous statement that prophets are never sent except to strong tribes because they could never succeed in the absence of a strong constituency to give them strength to succeed. So in evaluating the prospects of political success, according to Ibn Khaldun, it's not enough to be correct. It's not enough to be morally right. Right? You also have to be able to gauge whether you have the social strength to survive. And for that reason, he mocks many of the revolutionaries of his time who, although they're right, that the rulers they're revolting against are tyrannical, usurpers, et cetera, because they lack social basis to succeed, they always end up creating, they always lead their people to crushing defeats. And so that was basically the background to what I thought the problem of the revolutionary or the liberal camp was that they did not properly understand the balance of social power in Egypt following the revolution. So I postulated that there were 3 kinds of groups involved in removing Hosni Mubarak. One, there were the revolutionaries who can say were the catalyst, who started the revolution, who called for people to come out on January 25th. Second, and they were interested in more or less a kind of radical change of Egyptian society. Then there was a second group, which you might call the Muslim Brotherhoods, the Muslim Brotherhood kind of group, or the sympathizer of the Muslim Brotherhood, who did not initiate the revolution, but were willing to join it. But they weren't necessarily revolutionary. They were much more interested in a kind of gradualist reform. And for them, formal democracy was very important because they believed that the state was fundamentally okay if you could introduce some kind of accountability and rule of law. Right? So you didn't need to dismantle the state. You just needed to provide democratic accountability to it, and Egypt could begin to move in the proper direction. And then finally, you had a group of people who didn't see this as revolutionary or reformist at all because they thought the only problem was Hosni Mubarak and his family. So their understanding of January 25th was preventing tawrith, what the Egyptians called it, inheriting or the position of turning over the presidency to Mubarak's son. Right? So there were three different camps in Tahrir, I would say. There were those who believed in radical change, there were those who believed in reformist change, and there were those who believed just get rid of the president and his entourage and we're done. Now, it wasn't clear on February 11th which group was the strongest, but I argued in the piece that through the series of these elections that followed Mubarak's resignation, it became clear that the battle was between reformists and those who just saw the problem as being limited to Hosni Mubarak and his family and his cronies.
Mohammed, could you move a little bit back from the microphone because it's cutting out?
Okay. And so the issue then for the liberals/revolutionaries is what to do given this fact that you don't have a deep social base of support. Should you support the formal democratic process, or should you continue in seeking revolutionary legitimacy? Now, in my opinion, they chose the path of revolutionary legitimacy. And I thought that was disastrous because, one, it had no chance of success. Because the actual power of different social forces in the country was arrayed against them. Secondly, what it did do was it prevented this alliance between the Islamists and the non-Islamists from standing up to the military and establishing a new basis for the polity, right? And as a result, Egypt never enjoyed any kind of post-Mubarak stability. And from my earliest days as a student of political thought, as an undergraduate, one of the classical criticisms of democracy, of course, was that it led to factionalism, it led to strife, it prevented any kind of stability and always ended up resolving itself in favor of tyranny. And so from the beginning of the transition, I was quite concerned that there would be revolutionary overreach and that there would not be satisfaction with achieving some kind of formally democratic regime that over time could transform the Egyptian state in favor of the kind of direct action that succeeded in the 18 days of January and February 2011. And that's where I primarily faulted the revolutionaries. They thought that by continuing to confront the state after the election of Mohammad Morsi and the Muslim Brothers in the parliamentary election, i.e. the legitimacy of the street as opposed to the legitimacy of the parliament that was referred to in the earlier session, that they would be able to create a more perfect democracy. I was worried from the very beginning that the only thing this would succeed in is empowering the forces of authoritarianism. And I think that, unfortunately, is what happened. And in the article, I go through several possible reasons as to why they might have believed that. But in each case, I thought that their fears were implausible. Not irrational, but implausible. For example, chief among them was that Morsi never had control of the security services. So if it was true that the Muslim Brotherhood had some secret totalitarian Islamist agenda, something that I'm agnostic about, and I have no way of knowing what in fact their true agenda was. But what I did know was that they had no means to implement it. And so from my understanding of liberal theory of militant democracy, at least as discussed by Rawls, there is a place for militant democracy, right, to prevent illiberal, intolerant parties from taking power. But the threat has to be imminent, and it has to be objective. And in this case, from my perspective, there was neither an imminent threat nor was it objective, because the ability to impose such an agenda requires control of the means of coercion, which Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood clearly did not have. And then there was also a second question, was that, and I think Shadi already referred to this, they had alternative means of opposing the Muslim Brotherhood, namely parliamentary elections, the possibility of impeaching the president if they won 2/3 of the vote, which by all indications, they should have been able to do. At least if you believe the rhetoric that everybody in Egypt hated the Muslim Brothers, then it should have been quite easy for them to win a supermajority in the parliament and impeach the president, which they could have done. They had lots of legal alternatives to block the ostensibly totalitarian religious fascism that they claimed was the predicate justifying their support for a coup. So in short, what I tried to argue in the paper was that Egypt was ideologically very divided. It was unrealistic to believe that Egypt could emerge from 50 years of authoritarianism into a liberal or post-liberal direct democratic utopia. The best that could reasonably be achieved based on the empirical realities of Egyptian society and the insights of political philosophy was a kind of thin procedural democracy where everybody agreed to abide by the rules of formal democracy. And then that would give us hope for a better day in the future once Egypt was able to solve the pressing structural problems that had generated the crisis that led to January 25th. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the liberals defected from the January 25th coalition because they lost. And having done so and thrown in their hat with the military, they were an indirect cause to everything that happened after July 3rd, including the massacre at Rabaa. And what concerns me now is that Egypt is much worse off than it was on January 24th, 2011. January 24th, 2011, there was still a prospect of an Islamist, non-Islamist alliance. It seems to me that that prospect is done. I don't see how it can be resurrected in my lifetime. And so I see very grim prospects for any kind of democracy in Egypt. And I also think that it's very unlikely that the new authoritarianism in Egypt will be successful in solving any of Egypt's problems. So I have grave concern over the viability in the medium term of the Egyptian state, because I don't see the Egyptian state as being capable of generating sufficient public will or political will to be able to tackle the problems that gave rise to January 25th in the first place. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. I'm going to ask our invited panelists to take about 5 minutes to respond to Mohammed's paper and the comments that he just made. Maybe we'll start with Micheline this time. Micheline, this time you won't be cut off. There's no one coming into the room, so there's a lot of time for us to sort of examine the thesis and to go from there. Then we'll maybe go with Andrew and then Dan.
Thank you, Nader, for organizing, Danny and Nader and Doug for organizing this. This is always great. Sorry for my voice. I just come from Sicily when it was a conference on the ICC, which stands for International Criminal Court. And now I am thinking I have to talk about Al-Sisi. So I'll try to switch and make sure that I stay on message. With respect to the discussions we had last fall with Mohammad Fadel, a very spirited and animated one, which was later on culminated into the Boston Review exchange, we did discuss several things. My argument against your argument at that time was that I believe that the reasons of the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood, which I believe is actually analytically perfectly correct to suggest that they failed substantively, politically, and economically, was on the following rationales. So I suggested that that they lacked the capacity to build a consensus within the Egyptian populations, that in fact it was illustrated by the constitutions of 2012, which to me was highly problematic, not just on procedural level, but also on substantive level. I was a little bit perplexed as to the famous and infamous return now of the Article 2, which suggests that Sharia law is the primary source of legislations. And I also was very perplexed about the fact that Al-Azhar, the religious institution, which still will have constitutional authority in matter of legislation, and I was very pleased to find out that in the current constitutions, at least Al-Azhar, as in terms of constitutional authority, was one of the articles that was removed. So I didn't see quite a movement that ultimately succeeded in being voted to power, that was able to develop that form of legitimacy, and it's a problem in any post-revolutionary process, at least in the way I have studied the revolutionary processes. I found also one of the big problems is that religion, in my opinion, does not provide us with any particular insight or understanding when it comes to issues of political economy. And as we know, the Muslim Brotherhoods were from a political economic perspective going, we had billionaires on the one hand and very paupers on the other hand, and sort of the principle of political economy went all over the way, and I didn't see why a religious perspective would actually in any way provide the foundations of what was required for a transitional stage. In fact, that they succeeded in not only alienating the International Monetary Fund, but with the exceptions of the Qatari, no countries were ready to pay the bill for the transitional stage. There was a very poor, despite the fact that indeed al-Sisi had been appointed by Morsi, there was a very poor rapport between Morsi and al-Sisi on the long run, which created major problems with respect to the unfolding social protests from 2012 until the summer of 2013. So I think that in and of itself suggests that the movement, which became a party, was not a good hegemonic, what we call sort of good hegemonic party that needs to take over in a post-revolutionary situation, and as a result, it deserved to fail. They fail, and therefore they deserve to fail. With respect to the second stage, the post-2013 coup, and I think that that's part of the debate we did not have. I'll be the first one to suggest that many revolutions end up, many, but not all, in a military coup. There is always many situations of disorder, chaos, disorganizations, and so it's not a surprise that we see military coup happening within a year or so after the revolutionary process. But also the first one to say that authoritarianism, by definition, which is always following military coup, is always anti-human rights. It's never consistent with human rights principle. No one wished to see an authoritarian government taking over after a period of chaos and disorder. And yet, the question is, are there certain forms of authoritarian entities, post-revolution, that are better than others? We also know, for instance, that there are famously some, like Napoleon III, who actually took during the 18 Brumaire, in 1851, seized power and succeeded in overthrowing a liberal regime. We know that those situations occur, I would not call it liberal, but overthrow the regime as a result of a very volatile situations in France. We know that in the 19th century and the 20th century, we had the occurrence of many military coups and authoritarianism, namely in Latin America. There was a lady in the audience that was mentioning that, or in Africa as well, we have many military coup and authoritarian governments. The question, however, is that there are certain forms of authoritarian government which come to power after a revolutionary process and a military coup that actually succeed in moving a country to a democratic democracy. I have in mind Portugal in 1960 or Turkey in 1973, and that is very different, of course, of the situations of, for instance, Gaddafi or Bashar in Sudan. So those are two different forms of authoritarianism and post-revolutionary. And then the question that I like to put on the table, and that is not, it's sort of probably a controversial question, is al-Sisi, despite the terrible beginning, the massacre of Rabat is, of course, in the mind of everyone, despite a terrible beginning, but nonetheless there is short longevity to figure out how much the trajectory of his government and his ruling is. Is there a possibility to actually see him turning to the Portuguese style, or do we, some of you in the audience or in the panel, think that he might actually move toward a more Gaddafi style or Mubarak style? What do we see? What are the signs? So, of course, the Rabat moment is not is dashing all hopes for success. But if we look at the economy situation, so at least the economic environment, since al-Sisi came to power, we see it's so much more favorable than the one that Morsi inherited. In a way, the Gulf countries have opened their checkbooks. They have already given 12 billion to the Egyptian and are preparing a package of 20 billion. We know also that the Americans have released funds that they had frozen initially. We know that the European Union is also discussing about developing the development of certain part of Egypt. We know that the World Bank is also estimate of some possible economic progress as a result of the sort of initial largesse of the Gulf countries. And so the question becomes is are we moving to a more, do we see positive sign? I'm not just saying that I can forecast the future, certainly not, but this is sort of a fair question that I think that the panel can sort of consider. Are we moving forward to, do we see signs that are sort of more optimistic than the one I heard in the previous session? Of course, money is not sufficient. It has to be invested in the correct way. I'm sure that many of you have read the effort of al-Sisi to develop public project works like the Suez Canals, among other projects, which I think that reminds us of the old economic development of the Nasserist period. In and of itself, it will be not sufficient. There will be an important to develop private space also for free enterprise, because that really created a major stagnation, economic stagnation during the Mubarak era. So I think that that will be a welcome process or a welcome space to consider when we wonder, when we assess the track record of the al-Sisi government. So last, I want just to make a point. I'm probably going beyond my time. One last point. It's the issues of ideology. And I think Mohammad Fadel suggested, I think, a year ago and later on, the problem of ideology, sort of like it's tearing apart countries. I like to make the opposite argument. And that is to suggest that usually in a post-revolution, post-conflict, post-independent situation, there is a need to create a type of ideology, short-term type of ideology, but that nonetheless will succeed in gluing together various fragments of society. It's either religion or nationalism. It can't be a third one. Neither one nor the other have a political or an economic program. However, it brings people together. There is this notions now that we need a new Arab identity, or is it sort of the Islamists who are going to claim that? And I think that in and of itself, that's an important question. Although nationalism is not a political program, it's nonetheless providing a sense of a re-empowerment of people who feel that they have no job or lost all sense of dignity. And so in and of itself, I think that that's something to consider when we are talking about the capacity of a government to move forward and hopefully in a positive way. I do not know whether that will be the case with the al-Sisi government. I just wanted to highlight a few positive signs, despite the terrible ones that we know of as a result of the crackdown of the Muslim Brotherhood. But I would nonetheless like to highlight those ones, and we know that transitions take time. In fact, in a thesis that he wrote in 2006, al-Sisi suggests that democracy is a very long process. It has to be methodical, it has to be logical, and it has to be controlled.
Okay, thank you, Micheline. I forgot to mention in my introductory remarks that one of the initial respondents in the Boston Review to Mohammad Fadel's essay is Ellis Goldberg, and even though he's not on our four invited guests, he is here as part of our conference, and so we'll get to you, Ellis, because I think your comments in the Boston Review essay sort of really amplify and deepen this conversation. Let me now turn over to Andrew March, and then we'll get to Dan, and then we'll expand the conversation. Andrew?
Thank you very much. Well, I'm a political theorist or a political philosopher, and while I don't have the indifference to or contempt for facts that some of my colleagues have, I'm certainly not going to try to compete with the people that are gathered here today in terms of a contextual understanding of what's happened in Egypt since 2011. So what I'd like to do by way of responding to Mohammed and some of the things from the earlier panel is just to sort of step back a little bit and say, is there anything here that's distinctly sort of theoretical or philosophical about the failed Egyptian transition, in addition to some of the very, very sophisticated questions that we've asked comparatively about transitions from authoritarianism or military-state relations and things like that. So as a brief response to Mohammed, and maybe as a way of introducing some of my other questions, I find it unpersuasive, the idea that, insofar as there were perhaps certain people that had a utopian or a very idealistic conception of democracy that saw the transformation of the entire state or regime rather than the removal of Mubarak as the key to understanding the failed transition, because these were the weakest people. This was the weakest group by far. The kids of Tahrir, if that's what's being mentioned. Certainly the elites who populated the National Salvation Front didn't have any sort of non-cynical conception of democracy, never mind the kind of direct or participatory democracy that many people around the world found very exciting about Tahrir, the way that people found the Occupy movement and other protests of that year very exciting. So if it's not too presumptuous, let me just say that here are a couple of things that I think are of sort of universal interest for the study of politics that are raised by the Egyptian transition. First is the problem of founding or refounding and the dilemma or perhaps paradox of revolutionary authority. So we've spoken about, whether, was Morsi an autocrat? Then there was the response, well, maybe, transitory periods are supposed to be somewhat autocratic. But there was a deep ambiguity in my mind during the Egyptian period of what remained of the sovereignty and legitimacy of the existing institutions that were created, that were in effect in the constitutional structure leading up to 2011. To what extent was the existing constitutional order in effect, the Constitutional Court, and to what extent had that entire constitutional order been suspended in some symbolic, moral, political way, and that a higher form of sovereign legitimacy or authority, whether it was the square or the street or some kind of moral commitment. So that was a deep ambiguity, which I think eclipses the question of whether somebody was autocratic or not. When you had the Supreme Constitutional Court dissolving institutions, it's not at all obvious to what should have been the highest appeal of authority, precisely when the legitimacy of the existing institutions was precisely what was being called into question. As a more normative, we can sort of fall into a kind of rote discussion of illiberal democracy versus liberal democracy, militant democracy. The question I think that's interesting is what kinds of interests legitimately trump democratic populism. So, it's hard to find a greater principle of legitimacy than an open election to a constituent assembly, which is what you had in Tunisia, which is not exactly what you had in Egypt. But nonetheless, there you could have the maximally representative kind of constituent assembly, modeled after perhaps the French Revolution transition. And yet the question at stake is not some abstract conception of liberalism versus democracy, but what core interests? And that is deeply unclear in the Egyptian context. Is it your existing lifestyle? Is it some abstract, freedom to choose, freedom of religion, freedom of preserving existing sorts of privileges and advantages that you have at that period? But I think that is a slightly more consistent way of phrasing the question. When you have a situation in which everybody agrees that the standard of legitimacy and authority is a representative period of constituent politics, the question is, what kinds of interests do we think trump what comes out of that democratic procedure? A slightly less normative question that's related to this, and I think is also contributing to a certain amount of confusion, is what do we think politics is about? At one point, and I think it's another essay that Shadi wrote for The Atlantic, The End of Pluralism, he talks about the suspension of politics. Well, show me a place where politics is suspended. Now, so yes, on one conception, perhaps an Arendtian conception of politics, or even a Madisonian conception of politics, where we understand politics as deliberation, as the management of disagreement, as the resolution of disputes, as a procedure for resolving problems or competition over resources, yes, that's absolutely dead under Sisi. But that's not the only understanding of politics, and that's not what drives a lot of people into politics. There's also another conception of politics which is almost the exact opposite, where politics is not about the pursuit of interest or the pursuit of relative advantage, but it's the pursuit of meaning or purpose, most often represented through the language of sacrifice. What are you willing to sacrifice for? What are you willing to regard as a locus for ultimate meaning? And there, I think that both the Sisiites, those, we have in one of our pictures here, the sort of the cult around Sisi, that's the kind of politics that is being offered, in the famous sort of stock phrase of Carl Schmitt, the kind of friend-enemy dichotomy, where politics is the mobilization of enmity, it's the mobilization of this sense of being at risk. And what's very interesting from my perspective is that that's not a kind of politics that, by and large, I think the Brotherhood or the FJP played during the transitory period. Perhaps in some of the less official discourses that was at stake, but I think that's a crucial question to ask. Is politics is always there, and the question is, who is mobilizing what conception of politics for what purpose? Democratic commitment. What is democratic commitment, and how do you measure it, particularly in a revolutionary period of transition? So one question is, I don't think there's any question that the Islamists, as they developed after the period of the 1970s and 80s, were committed to a conception of democracy. And if you ask a Salafi, what's the difference between you and the Brotherhood? One of the first things they will say, in addition to certain aspects of creed and dogma, which the Brotherhood are a little bit squishy, is their commitment to democracy. There's no doubt for a certain kind of Salafi that the Brotherhood has a doctrinal religious commitment to democracy that is problematic for them. Were they, however, at the same time, representative of a deeply anti-democratic political culture or ethos or attitude? That seems to me absolutely clear. Now, what's our conclusion from this? Well, what's our question, perhaps theoretically? The first, I think, is what is the sovereign people? When you say you're democratic, that means you want a certain conception of the people or the demos to govern. Now, the Brotherhood or the Islamist movement in exile had a certain conception of what that was that doesn't map perfectly onto any old people or this particular citizenry. But neither does the movement that has been mobilized after July 3rd. In fact, they are much more obvious in playing the Schmittian politics of saying, no, there is a real Egyptian people that exists. And that is the only sovereign community or sovereign people that matters. And it's very clear that it's very clear that anybody that belonged to the Brotherhood movement is expressly outside of that. And in fact, the refoundation of the sovereign community is about the exclusion of that. So that's one way, I think, of framing so you think that the Islamists have this theory of democracy that develops in exile. Mona's written an excellent article on that. And yet, so what do you expect them to do, or what do you expect Ennahda to do when they're tempted with power? It doesn't mean that they're going to act like the Christian Democratic Party immediately. So they are a populist movement that bases their claim to authority on an ascending conception of popular legitimacy. And that is a kind of democracy, because democracy is very often much about matching outcomes to popular desires or identity as it is to abstract procedures. And the other question is democratic in comparison with what? What does it mean within the Islamist movement as has developed perhaps since the 40s and 50s to say that they have a commitment to democracy? So when you look at a kind of high utopian Islamism, which rejects democracy as a kind of idolatry, then I think the moves towards democratic commitment are sincere. But again, from the clearly emotional commitment to consensus-based politics that you see on the part of somebody like Ghannouchi in Tunisia, there was a wide range of styles of politics with which that Islamist democratic commitment is compatible. And let me just conclude, since I think I'm also over my time. How do we understand the problem of constitutional founding? So people, particularly Americans, love to get very, very romantic about constitutional moments because we have a mythology, a religion perhaps, around our own constitutional moment. We see it as creating a new birth, a founding, something that's above ordinary politics. And there weren't the same kinds of political parties that developed very, very soon after Philadelphia. You know, we all know that story. Then there's the other extreme which says, no, constitutional politics is ordinary politics. It's bargaining. It's not that different from from normal bargaining over coalition making. And that's true. That seems to be clearly what's represented in the Egyptian transition. But I want to raise one other moment that in between those two, there is a sense in which this kind of constitution making was special because it was an opening in which a new form of competition for power was going to be inaugurated. Less a sense of high principle and a permanent agreement about rights and liberties and freedoms and justice, but a new mode of competing for power, and that's exceptionally dangerous and exceptionally threatening. And so I think that we need to also see the transition as a kind of game theory, which is not a deeply insightful point to make, but that you don't know what your competitors are going to do in the future. And so is Morsi an autocrat in the year he's about? Of course, he had no opportunity to be. But does that have anything to do with what you think may be risks to your interests once this system stabilizes and acquires a certain measure or imprimatur of legitimacy and authority? And in that condition of uncertainty and deep, deep lack of trust between political parties, it makes perfect sense to me that you might say that there are problems with the Constitution in order to justify your mistrust of it. But what's really going on, I think, is a fear that there's going to be a window in which you will never again be able to have your interests represented in disproportion to your demographic power. And so there's a sort of game theory in which if you don't make your move now, it's going to close. And I think that's another way of understanding what seems to us here in the West as this insane gap between the crazy rhetoric about how bad the Brotherhood was and the facts on the ground. There is that psychological dimension of mistrust, fear, paranoia that is hard to understand and doesn't match up to the facts, but maybe at some level explicable.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Let's go to Dan now for your sort of comments on Mohammad Fadel's thesis, and then we will try and expand the conversation to the rest of the panel.
Thanks, and I'll try to speak quickly. I reread Mohammad's piece last night, and I thought before I left I made copies of all the other commentaries, including Ellis's, and I did not. I simply made 2 copies of Mohammad's piece, which I then read twice, and thought the critique was very close to the one that was being set out in the beginning, so it was a bit confusing initially. But I'm going to say a few things very quickly that echo what Andrew said here. I think that I guess I simply disagree with the argument that what unfolded in Egypt was a consequence of the way the revolutionaries acted and their defection. I don't think there was ever a clear alliance from the very beginning. This was a profoundly divided opposition, and I think the divisions were in many respects existential. So it's not simply a matter of revolutionary versus reformist versus the group that wanted to maintain more or less a status quo. I think what was going on was a difference of opinion over basically how to organize the polity in a very fundamental sense. And I think in that sense, if you look at the transitions literature with all its rationalist assumptions, it really isn't concerned with these existential issues. The issue of national identity or identity at all is not part of that literature, and so it really can't really anticipate what happens when you have these fundamental questions. And I think any transition involves a dynamic by which the fear that was used to hold the regime or the alliance together before declines. And in the case of Egypt, rather than have a declining fear, you had the increasing fear, particularly from the left and from the liberals, on a number of issues, not only philosophical. And I think precisely that dynamic is the one which fed the concerns of the leftists and the concerns of the liberals. But I think that problem was not addressed very clearly or very effectively by the leadership of the Muslim Brethren. If you contrast that leadership to the way Ghannouchi has behaved, he's been very, very attentive to trying to address those fears, because he knows that even if this other side represents a small part of the population, he has to have some sort of basic consensus, and therefore he was very much ready to override elements within the Sharia Council of the Ennahda Party by telling them that they had to make concessions to address these fears. In many respects, the whole Egyptian process was overdetermined from the very beginning, I think, by, among other things, a sequencing of the transition by which you went to elections and then to the creation of a constitution, whereby had you had an effort to build a constitution based on consensus to begin with and then elections, I think you could have perhaps reduced the fear. I don't think, by the way, that the liberals or the secularists or the non-Islamists or the revolutionaries had any sense that they would win an election. I'm sure they felt that in the next round of elections they would lose as well. By the way, and I say this being steadfastly against the coup. I mean, I think this was a huge error. I think they miscalculated. But I don't think they believed that they could win an election. I think the concern of the left and the liberals was precisely that a political order was being built through the mechanism of democracy that would impose a ideological and political agenda and an economic agenda that they could not reverse. And therefore, they were profoundly afraid of the consequences of elections. So I think this whole thing was, I think there are many, I'll sum up here, I think there are many mistakes made by many leaders on the left, among the liberals, among the leaders of the Muslim Brethren. I would not want to privilege the mistakes of any one particular group, but I do feel that in the context of a transition, it's incumbent upon the most powerful element in the opposition to take into account the fears and vulnerabilities of the weakest. This is really critical, and if you're not ready to do this and you simply dismiss them, I remember very well after the fall of the Mubarak government and the construction and the beginning of the dynamic 2012, Osama Aryan said very clearly, we're going to have nothing to do with the liberals. They have no place in our society. And he dismissed them, and he dismissed all their interests as irrelevant to the agenda. And he was the agenda of the Muslim Brethren, and he was explicit about that. I think when you do that, engage in that sort of rhetoric, which was echoed by the president himself, Morsi, I think you're really making it very difficult to create the kind of alliance that might perhaps never would have had a chance to deal with and negotiate with the military, but at the very least, it would have been given that opportunity, and that was not there.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to turn back to...
That's 5 minutes. That's a 5-minute response.
It was 5 minutes. I'm going to turn back to Mohammad Fadel, since the discussion here is revolving around your paper. Do you want to respond to anything that has been said by the other two panelists, and then we'll broaden the conversation?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very difficult to assess claims about, clearly the Morsi failed, the Muslim Brotherhood failed. But I tend to look at this as a failure of Egypt, not as a failure of a particular party, from the very beginning. And part of it, I think, is, I try to be, I guess, a rational political scientist, even though I'm not a political scientist, right? And that, look at, the reasons why we should not be worried about extremism in the context of democracies. There's the median voter hypothesis, theorem, et cetera, and whatever the Muslim Brotherhood says to its own activists inside, their secret meetings or whatever they do in their whatever, that they are going to be responsive to an actual electorate, which is competitive and which is fractured. And so I keep going back to the actual results of elections. And the Muslim Brotherhood, as Micheline properly said, was not a hegemonic party. Right? And that, to me, was something that I took comfort in. I remember during the revolution, I came on some Canadian TV shows and said, aren't you worried about the Muslim Brotherhood taking over? I said, no, because they are not strong enough to take over Egypt, that they're going to have to work with other groups. Now, we can talk about, one thing that we haven't talked about here that might have made a difference. What if Egypt had opted for a parliamentary system as opposed to a presidential system? Parliamentary systems, of course, force you to cooperate and have coalitions with others in a way that a presidential system makes very, very difficult, right? And so there's a problem here with the term failure, in that if the Muslim Brotherhood failed to produce a cohesive political vision that could rally a social consensus, what about the other political parties? What about Mohammad Fadel? What about the Social Democrat Party that I thought would have a great future in the country? That where the prime minister compared Rabaa to D-Day, right? I mean, what does that say about their political vision? So failure here is a question of, first of all, it's a great social failure. Second of all, we have to look at relative responsibility. And I think that was the whole point of the piece, is that you can't expect a country to emerge out of 50 years of authoritarianism with no democratic experience to meet all these demands. It's going to take time, right, to fix the country. Now, did the Muslim Brotherhood have an economic plan? No. Does anybody? No. Does anybody have an economic plan to fix Egypt? If you want depressing reading, look at the macro statistics of Egypt. Right? It's a miracle the country is surviving the way it is, right? So if you want to be committed to democracy, you have to have some kind of faith in the future, not experience, because experience tells you everything's going to fail. And that's where I think political philosophy or some sort of theological commitment has to anchor your political action. Because if you don't have faith in the future, if you don't have any kind of faith in your fellow citizens, then you're always going to end up with a strongman. And this is what I think was the greatest fear. Now, Micheline asked, is it possible that Sisi will be a good strongman? Maybe. I hope. But it seems to me very, very unlikely, because my diagnosis of the weaknesses of the Egyptian state is that it's driven by rent-seeking on an epic scale. And he is putting together, his base of support are those very rent-seekers. So I think he has very, very limited room to operate. And I think it's very telling that the only international investment he's getting is from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, right? With the Suez Canal project, there was no attempt to raise money internationally, right? I think basically he's going to be selling bonds to Egyptians. They'll end up losing money when inflation exceeds the coupon rate. So I don't see any positive signs that Sisi will be a rational autocrat. Many signs to the contrary. And so, Dan, I would just say that any fool, someone would have to be a fool to reject the possibility of consensus where consensus is there. I don't see the possibility of a consensus in Egypt. That's why I said the only thing that was reasonably available to Egyptians was what Rawls calls a modus vivendi, where people agreed to abide by the outcomes of fair procedures and then hope over time that something better could emerge. Because if there is a possibility for consensus, nobody has offered it, right? What all the opposition did was withdraw. They didn't. I don't know of one proposal that could have brought together the Constituent Assembly that included people like Burhami, who was way, 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 way to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of his religious demands, and the Coptic Church and certain secularist parties. Where were you going to find a consensus constitution in that? Right? The only thing that I thought was reasonably achievable was actually what was achieved, some kind of opening of the political space and giving everybody an opportunity to have their voices heard, right? And that would give you hope for a better tomorrow. But I think that's been taken away, unfortunately.
So there's a long literature, an old-standing literature in political science about the problem of democracy in divided societies. And societies can be divided through a lot of different ways. It can be divided in through sort of permanent or relatively permanent ethnic or social groups. So Northern Ireland, Lebanon, India, and you have a long tradition of studying Bosnia. But then you also have a period of politics in Europe where the conflict between sort of right-leaning Christian democratic parties and left-leaning communist or social democratic parties was sort of at a permanent stalemate. And rather than sort of this constitutional consensus where everybody agreed to have a competitive, there were these sort of agreements that's in the literature called consociationalism to sort of have a semi-permanent dampening of competitive politics where people, the long-term risks of competitive politics were reduced. And so everybody knew that there would be these sort of permanent slots given, and what's relevant for Egypt is not only an ethnic but also an ideological ground. So the communists or the social democrats knew that they were guaranteed a certain amount of power. So did the right-leaning parties. And this was viewed as a response to the possibility of civil war or social breakdown. And that strikes me as the other big question about Egypt, is a deeply divided society. We can discuss on what grounds it was divided. Was it that there were these clear ideologies, that there were the Islamists, and then people who had a strong non-Islamist identity? We all know that many of the people that supported Sisi were deeply religious and perhaps some sense supportive of a role for religion in the state and the state in religion. So it's not by any means a secular religious divide, but nonetheless you have these groups that see themselves as agonists, who see, zero sum, that, the rise of one is the loss of the other. And so it's easy to wish for these kinds of things, but the role of the army could have been something like a openly declared guardian of that kind of constrained, limited democratic consociational politics, where it was just declared, we will play this role, it'll be open, it's not just our own military budget, but the limits of this democratic process are going to be set and declared in advance.
Yeah, great. Dan?
Yeah, since I kept my 5 minutes so scrupulously, I want to say, I was struck, Mohammed, by that remark you just made, which was in your piece, which was there was no basis, and perhaps you're absolutely right. I mean, that's quite a sobering sort of observation to be made. But on the other hand, I've seen other experiences in other countries where the divide, and by the way, the divide was over many issues. For example, the revolutionaries, they had an economic agenda that was revolutionary. They also wanted to put the military in the dock. And they wanted to go right away on that. You heard them talk about these things which are completely unrealistic, talking about the prospects for sort of negotiating. In that sense, the Muslim Brethren were much more realistic. And then you always got, all of us had experienced this in Tahrir, where you spoke to the revolutionaries, and it was like Woodstock. Like, man, I don't do politics. I'm an activist, and I'm into activism, and I don't do parties. And meanwhile, everybody else is doing the parties. So that was disconcerting. So there was a lot of that. But I do think that I wouldn't dismiss the possibility. Of course, the military didn't want a consensus, did it? Right. And they were dead set against it. And and the name of the game in Egypt was to manipulate all these fears, one against the other. And everybody thought they could go to the military and sort of negotiate their old side deal. And the military said, oh, well, okay, let's see how I can work this. And they did it, in that sense, quite effectively. You've got to have a willingness to sort of step away from that game. And even in the context where there are very profound ideological differences, if you take the example of, again, Tunisia, but elsewhere, there are ways to agree on procedures and make concessions in constitutions which might, to some extent, address the fears of the potential losers here, the liberals, the leftists, that might have worked, but that chance simply wasn't there. So I wouldn't say that this is a divided society yet on many levels, but I wouldn't say that would have precluded an outcome. I'm not quite, but it certainly made it very difficult. I would agree with that.
Micheline?
Well, it seemed to me that when we talk about the fair play of democracy after the revolution, it's actually a very different ballgame. We cannot be in the same place as in Western democracy. So, for instance, if a party, whatever that name is, Muslim Brotherhood or any other party, was to take over thanks to popular vote, in a scarce economy, that party will need to find stakeholders to make sure that they can build a base, to make sure that they can have the loyalty necessary to continue to proceed and steward political program forward. There's issues of concession to many a different fragment of society is simply not feasible or practical, particularly when the economy of Egypt, given the economy of Egypt in particular, and given also the lack of repertoire of those representation. So I think that this discussion could probably be a correct conversations in 10 or 15 years down the road. That is, if we keep to be optimistic. With respect to the notions of concessionalism, I don't think that the Lebanese case is like the Egyptian case.
I meant more like Belgium and Austria.
Yes, but there is no ethnic division to the same extent. The divisions that exist in Egypt are based on social classes, also religious, but social classes. Not so. It's different than Lebanon or Libya or Syria in that sense. And with respect to your pessimism, when it comes to the fact that Egypt is not having sufficient fund to actually get, propel its economy forward, I'd like to just sort of entertain, hopefully, and nobody knows the future, but the opposite. I mean, think of it. Egypt is probably in a better position today than any other, well, with the exceptions of Tunisia, than any other Arab countries that have experienced the Arab uprising. I know it's a surprise because in a year from now ago we would not have said that, but in light of the stretch of ISIL from Libya, Iraq to Syria, in light of the fact that we had just recently a war in Gaza, and in light of the fact that we're still continuing to see the rise of belligerent, whether it's Sunni or Shia militarism, I truly think that there will be a lot of effort, particularly in the international community, to try to make sure that Egypt is a stable magnet in the region, a stable outpost. So, time will tell us if I'm right or not, but I'd like to suggest that perhaps we should remain positive on this one.
Okay, Mohammed, Josh, Mona, and then Mohammed Al-Masri, and then Shadi. Go ahead.
See, the reason why I'm pessimistic is that you have to have political will to adopt good policies, right? I mean, you can be flooded with money, but then just use it to pay off your constituency, right? Your rent-seeking constituency. And I think that's what happened last year with the $20 billion that they got from the Gulf. My understanding is the Gulf has not renewed aid at that level. I don't know. I haven't read anything to that effect. That's why Sisi had to introduce the beginning of austerity measures, because the Gulf did not renew aid at that level. And so this is, to me, the question is, how do you form political will to change in the absence of democracy? You could have an incredibly strong, popular autocrat, but I don't think Sisi fits that bill or even understands necessarily the depth of the problems facing Egypt. I mean, I think it's important to compare Egypt not to Syria and Iraq, which have much greater problems than Egypt objectively, but compare it to a country like Indonesia. Indonesia is doing much, much, much better than Egypt, even though it's poorer on a per capita basis. Indonesia's income is $5,500 per capita. Egypt is like $6,600. But yet Indonesia has made remarkable economic and political progress since the fall of Suharto, right? Whereas Egypt seems to be snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. It had an opportunity to take a big step forward, and people panicked. Like my father-in-law says, Sisi saved us from the unknown. Well, the known is that your state is collapsing. That's the unknown. The unknown is that you never tried to govern cooperatively.
Josh?
I guess I'm a little bit concerned about describing Egypt as stable. I mean, I don't think Egypt's stable at all. I think it's less stable now than it's ever been, even if you do have this strongman Sisi there. And there's a lot of people that are in prison at the moment, or exiled, or have been killed, or on our hunger strike and these things. This is not the inkling of a stable regime. And I think that if we default back to talking about stability, I mean, it's effectively erasing or trying to erase the memory of what were massive citizen movements to expand rights. And it just seems to me that the United States, in this sense, has basically been on the exact same page as its regional allies in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Israel, and basically wanting a pretty firm counter-revolutionary movement to kind of stop the mobilization that was happening in Egypt. And so I don't think this is a recipe for stability. I think this is doubling down on existing policies that produced the uprisings in the first place, right? So the uprising is a symptom. It's not sort of causal in and of itself.
Okay, thanks. Mona?
Shifting gears here a bit, I want to pick up on something that Andrew said and give you a little factoid, because as I was listening to you, I remembered this. I excavated it from my memory. This is the point of founding moments or constitutional moments, and these kinds of political theory questions are far from irrelevant for the political context. What I mean by that is that these actual terms and words were being used by the political actors themselves to describe what they were experiencing. And let me give you just one example. On the eve of the presidential election, when the Supreme Court, as was mentioned in the previous panel, had just struck down the first democratically elected parliament, SCAF held a press conference, a highly covered press conference, 3 generals, where they were to make the official announcement that they were about to dissolve the parliament. And one of them very startlingly said that SCAF has constituent power. He actually used the term as-sulta ta'sisiyya. And he was very keen to push through this 2-hour press conference the line that the military isn't just a guardian. They were much, much more grabby than that. And they were open about it. This is not a secret behind closed doors type thing. They were telling the Egyptian public and international observers on the eve of the election that no matter what happens, and mind you, this is also the moment when they had stripped the presidency of all its powers. So Morsi was entering into this dramatically weakened and hamstrung institution. But to add insult to injury, they also said that no matter what, the Constituent Assembly that has been elected, all of that doesn't matter because we are the constituent power. And they were in this advised by very prominent jurists. Most public among them was Egypt's former Supreme Court, only female Supreme Court judge. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that these issues are not just matters of political theory or whatever, but they were actually discussed, and the military had a very huge interest in laying claim to its role, not just as a guardian, but as a steward and as the sovereign. That's exactly the word I'm looking for. That it was more sovereign than the Constituent Assembly.
And the difference with the European example that you cited, Andrew, is that the military was deeply invested in the political outcome, unlike the European cases where there was perhaps an argument where they could be neutral and be a sort of an arbiter between different constituencies. Yeah. Go ahead, quickly.
I will be very brief. So the real question is, everybody knows that the Egyptian army is invested in these outcomes. It's the amount of the percentage of the economy that it controls, its own interests. And a question that I would then pose back to the people that are better informed is, does it go deeper than this? Beyond just Sisi's own narcissism and cult of his own personality, and the Egyptian conception of, what Egypt looks like, and so forth, from the beginning, what was the politics and what was the ideology of this beyond just their own sort of material interests?
Right, great. Mohammed?
Thanks. So I have a lot of notes. If I start to ramble or if I talk too long, just cut me off, yeah. You're used to that. I was here for 5 months and you cut me off quite a bit. So we've been talking about the importance of going back and examining what happened over the past 2 or 3 years to see, who messed up, who made mistakes, so that if we have an opportunity in the future, we can correct them. And I think that's very constructive. And I agree that we have to look at what the Muslim Brotherhood did, because they were the group in office. They made a lot of miscalculations. I would sit down for an interview with a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I was in Egypt, by the way, for those that don't know, working at the American University in Cairo up until January of this year. And sometimes they didn't even know what was going on. I mean, I was asking a question, and they weren't even on the same page as me. They just misdiagnosed. It was like Muna said, deer in the headlights. In any case, but I'm like Mohammad Fadel in the sense that I do put a lot of onus on the non-Islamist forces, because I think that the mistakes that they made, really, they weren't just mistakes, but they were sort of seditious. They were undermining the democratic process, and they contributed directly to the fall of a nascent democratic order. But what I want to draw attention to is some of the assumptions. I mean, as we're going back to the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, I think we have to be fair in terms of examining some of the assumptions that we're making. First of all, something that goes back to the first session, we're asking, is it appropriate to ask the question, was Mohammad Morsi a dictator? Well, yeah, it's an important question, because the people in the streets on June 30th, and they were absolutely critical to this. Without the people in the streets, we don't get a military coup. The military knew this. The Brotherhood knew this. The non-Islamist liberals, whatever you want to call them, they knew this. They were in the streets, not for one reason, but one reason was because they thought Mohammad Morsi was a dictator. So yes, it's an important question, but as a caveat, it's not the only important question. The people were in the streets for 3 or 4 or 5 different reasons, but that was chief among them. Now, there have been suggestions that the Brotherhood didn't really do anything to create consensus, that they didn't really do anything to address fears. I think those are fair criticisms because I think the Brotherhood didn't do enough to allay fears. I think they didn't do enough to create consensus, but I think we need to we need to be nuanced. It's not that the Brotherhood didn't do anything. You know, Mohammad Morsi would start his speeches and he would go through all of these fears and he would try to put people at ease. So people would say, you're not a president for all Egyptians, which was a common narrative if you were following Egypt. So he would make a point to, I mean, it was almost overkill. I'm a president for all Egyptians. And he would call all the Egyptians out by name, all of the governorates. He would call out the Egyptian women, the Egyptian men, the Egyptian Christians, the Egyptian Muslims, the Egyptian liberals, the Egyptian Islamists. And it was just this kind of overkill. That's just one example. There are many other examples that we could go through. This idea that the Brotherhood didn't see anything coming, also, we need to problematize that a little bit. David Hurst did the last interview with Mohammad Morsi on June 29th, 2013, and he said one of the things that Morsi told him, but he told him this off the record, he said, David, I've been sabotaged since day one. So this wasn't a president who was just completely oblivious. Was he oblivious to some things? Yes. Did he have too much trust in Sisi? Yes. But he wasn't just a complete, absolute idiot that couldn't see anything. They were quite concerned in the lead up to June 30th. I can tell you this from firsthand knowledge. They were quite concerned about what might happen. And if we talk about attempts at consensus, also, we have to problematize this. The Brotherhood took over in June of 2012, or July 1st, 2012, and one of the first things that Morsi does, again, maybe he didn't go far enough, but he starts to try to build a consensus. He offers positions to people that were his political enemy. This is something that needs to be a part of the story. He offers the vice president position to Hamdin Sabahi, the guy who he just beat in the presidential election, who is an anti-Brotherhood figure. He offers Ayman Noor and Ahmed Maher, the 6th of April leader, and many other people positions. And what was the overwhelming response from the non-Islamists was rejection. So if we're going to talk about a lack of consensus, we have to bring that into play. There was systematic rejection of participation in any kind of Brotherhood government. When they asked Hamdin Sabahi and Ahmed Maher, why did you reject? They said, we don't want to have anything to do with a Brotherhood government. That's part of the story. Do I have more time or do I?
Well, can we, I mean, there's 2 other speakers
Okay,
and
that's
time is
fine.
fleeting, so I think that's a good contribution and we'll see if anyone responds to it. Shadi and then Ellis.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to make a point on whether the Brotherhood compromised, and also the comparison with Tunisia, which I think is interesting. I think what we have to keep in mind is that the Constitution, Morsi's Constitution or whatever you want to call it, wasn't the ideal Brotherhood Constitution. So even though it was quite illiberal in many ways, it was a far cry from what Brotherhood theorists might. If they had to lay out their ideal constitution, it would look very different than the 2012 Morsi Constitution. So for example, in their ideal world, Brotherhood leaders would probably want a constitution which put limitations on secular parties. So the kind of mirror image of the Turkish constitution where you can't have explicitly Islamist parties, that's the kind of thing that Islamists had talked about before. They don't anymore because it's not realistic. It sounds really bad. The international community would never go for it. So I think that's the kind of outer bound of what you could conceivably expect from an Islamist party if they could get their way. But the Brotherhood wasn't talking about any of those things. And the 2012 Constitution isn't an Islamist constitution at all. And there's very little in terms of the theory building that Islamist intellectuals and philosophers had been doing in previous decades that you actually see in that constitution. And in many ways, the most controversial articles, such as Article 219, which defined Sharia in a very kind of constricted way, was itself a compromise. You had the Salafis on the right flank who were asking for somewhat outlandish things about not just the principles of Sharia being the primary source, but the rulings or ahkam of Sharia being the primary source. So the Brotherhood was trying to avoid going in that direction. And Article 219, which liberals hated, was a compromise. So I think we have to problematize what we mean by the word compromise in these kinds of contexts. Now, I guess the question is, are we really asking Islamists to concede their Islamism? Because that seems to me to be the subtext of a lot of these conversations, that the Islamists should have done more. Yes, they could have done more, but that would have meant essentially conceding their Islamism. Is there anything wrong from a normative standpoint? Or let me put this differently. We might not like it, but from an Islamist standpoint, they should, in their own minds, be able to reflect their Islamism through the democratic process, through the constitutional process. Otherwise, there's a lack of democratic legitimacy. Let's say Islamists want a constitution that puts some restrictions on secular expressions of politics. We would have to ask ourselves, what about that is unacceptable when many secular countries put limitations on religious expressions of politics? Why do we privilege one over the other? And this is where Tunisia becomes very important. We had the most mild, fluffy, nice, diluted Islamists in the Arab world, the Ennahda party, who made compromise after compromise to the extent of not even having the word Sharia in the context. Just think about that for a second. A self-avowed Islamist party saying that, fine, we won't even have a mere mention of the word Sharia. But even with all of those concessions, we almost had the breakdown of the democratic transition the summer before last. So even though you had these nice fluffy Islamists, secularists in Tunisia were trying to bring down the Ennahda government. And I would actually posit the only reason we didn't have a full breakdown was because there wasn't an interventionist military. If there was, there would probably not be a democratic transition in Tunisia. And the leading secular parties all called for the dissolution of the government, which was elected, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, which was elected. They were calling for these things openly. So we have to ask ourselves, if even you have nice fluffy Islamists who make every single concession imaginable and you still have secular attempts to bring down the democratic order, that's pretty problematic. And that's why I'm less optimistic about Tunisia, because Islamists had to voluntarily step down from power. But what if they keep on winning elections? Are secularists in Tunisia willing to accept that in the medium to long run if it keeps on happening?
Thanks. Thanks, Shadi. Ellis, you're next, and then Micheline.
Okay.
And then Dan.
All that I was, well, okay. I'm not sure what happened, but I assume everybody can hear me.
Okay, sorry, there you go.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So let me just go back one quick step and say, I think that one fundamental issue here, which many people have raised, but we haven't addressed very directly, is that in a revolutionary situation or a constitutional founding moment, it's a question of defining the nature of political community. And that, I think, is much more problematic in Egypt in many ways than many people, including probably us, are really willing to admit. So it strikes me as interesting that if I follow the trajectory of Tariq al-Bishri over the last several years, someone who came to prominence when he rewrote his very famous book on the political movement between 1945 and 52, to say that the Muslim Brothers really were the essence of Egyptian political nationalism, who ended in 2013 with an almost total rejection in many ways, or criticism of their politics. And yet al-Bishri's perhaps even more important work is, of course, the Muslims and Christians in the framework of national identity. And it seems to me that that is an important kind of issue as we want to think about how people define citizenship. Not because the Christian community is so large, it's not very large, it's 5-7%. It's certainly not 10%, or it seems unlikely to be that large. But as a question of the nature of what we want citizenship to be, or what Egyptians want citizenship to be, and how to define the broad outlines of political membership. And I think this responds then, it's not a response, it illuminates perhaps some of the questions that Shadi and other people have raised, which is what are the basic outlines of this. There's just one last little technical point I want to make. As I understand many of the Supreme Court decisions and much of the legal framework, and I'm certainly not, I have no legal training, but many of these issues about, for example, consultation with the Azhar or the electoral, these have very specific meanings in Egyptian jurisprudence. And I don't think that they necessarily have the meaning that sometimes they're freighted with in terms of ordinary language. So to go back to the issue that Mohammed raised, the fact that Al-Azhar had to be consulted in Egyptian, as I understand Egyptian administrative jurisprudence, doesn't actually give anybody a veto power. It is, however, politically extremely important, regardless of its implication for the legal processes or administrative processes involved. And that's, again, where I think we see the conflict between political process and the actual specific administrative or other legal meaning of a lot of these terms. And that's why I think this particular period, to go back, is very different than democratic transition. It's a much more open, raw, in many ways even violent political period than we often give it credit for in terms of the transitology.
Great. Micheline, you're next, but Mohammed wanted to jump in, I think, respond to something that Ellis just said. So with your permission, I'll just go to Mohammed, and then we'll go to you.
Can somebody just turn their mic on?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, just really quickly, some background on that Azhar article. So just so people know, in 2012, the Constitution said Sharia is the law of the land, basically, or it's the principal source of legislation. Now, just some background, that's not new. That was there since the 1970s. And oh, by the way, it's still there even in the quote-unquote Sisi Constitution. So it's not really controversial from the standpoint of Egyptian society. Even some political or some opinion polling data suggests that even Christians don't have a problem with that, many Christians. Now, the article in question is this article that says Al-Azhar is responsible for interpreting the Sharia. And I think it's important to point out.
So its opinion was taken.
Yeah, its opinion was taken. Its opinion was taken. So in the Mubarak days, the Constitution just left that up to, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Ahmed could correct me, but it left it up to the High Constitutional Court. They were responsible for interpreting the Sharia. Now, from one perspective, that's fairly absurd because they have no technical training in Sharia. Nonetheless, in 2012, the liberals, not the Salafis, and not the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is a point that goes unnoticed, the liberals were the ones who suggested that Al-Azhar be responsible for interpreting the Sharia, whether we like the idea or not. What's that? Yeah, it was Amr Musa Tahdid, and specifically it was Amr Musa, and he thought this would be a great idea, and the liberals agreed with him, because then at least we know that the Brotherhood isn't interpreting the Sharia, it's Al-Azhar, this famous Islamic university authority, and they're neutral, and they're balanced, and they're moderate, and so on and so forth. So we're blaming the Brotherhood for something, implicitly, that they actually have nothing to do with.
Thanks, Mohammed. Micheline, and then Dan, and I think that's going to end it. Okay, and then we'll end with Mohammed.
Constitutional moment after revolution are extremely important, from the declarations of the rights of men and the citizen in France to other constitutions. And we always look for our constitution set the bar as high as possible, precisely because we know that politics and politicians like to trespass and violate the tenets of constitutional rights. So with respect to the constitutions of 2012, I would not take it so lightly. Article 2 and Azhar, I understand that it was instituted in the Mubarak era, and I understand that it was reinstituted again under al-Sisi in the constitutions that was amended in 2014. However, I do believe that thinking that Sharia law as one of the 2 or 3 articles that are still was in the constitutions of 2012 are just simply there but not really predominant, and that the Muslim Brotherhood were making extraordinary concession, it's not actually true. When you think that Sharia is actually subjugating Sharia law under family laws, 50% of the populations, I would not just say that it's a simple concession. It's an enormous concession. It's a significant concessions to democracy. And that in that way, I would just simply look at it slightly.
Let me just respond to that. I mean, you do realize that there's a difference between liberalism and democracy. I mean, I don't understand the argument you're making here. If the vast majority of Egyptians do believe that Islamic law should play some role in public life, that has to be reflected through any democratic process to the extent that even liberals, so-called liberals, don't have a problem with Article 2. The only way you would get rid of Article 2 is if you had a liberal autocrat who essentially a kind of Ataturk-style approach that would essentially not allow the masses to reflect the religiosity. That would be fundamentally undemocratic.
Well, we're actually a 38% turnout for the support of the Constitution, so I don't think that we have really an illustrations of democratic representations in the 2012 constitutions. But having said that, it's sort of like a cyclical argument to suggest that most Egyptians are really confident and at ease with Sharia law, particularly women, seems to me...
It's factually true. I mean, all the polling we have, and we can kind of debate what specifics of Islamic law, but I don't know anyone who would argue that there isn't broad support for Islam playing a prominent role in public life. The only disagreement is to what extent and what that means in practice. But I would even refer you to, I mean, even on the issue of women, there was one example of this, a 2012 YouGov poll where only 18% of Egyptians said they believed that a woman should be president. And if you break it down by gender, only 24% of Egyptian women believe that their fellow women should be presidents. So this is something that goes well beyond men. And this is nothing new. I mean, this is what the polling tells us. Now, you can make an argument that there's a kind of false consciousness here, but that is the reality of these societies, is that they're deeply conservative.
Micheline, you want to respond, and then we'll move to the next.
Just say something just out of for accuracy.
Okay, okay. Let Micheline respond to if you want to, and then we'll go to Imad, and then back to the
I guess
the
this
schedule.
is an argument that we began at the beginning with Mohammad Fadel when we discussed about the difference between procedural democracy and human rights. Right. They are not always consistent. We know we can elect in government party, which saw in Gaza the elections in 2006 of Hamas. We can elect in power governments. Parties that are fundamentally not consistent with the principles of human rights and women's rights issue. So I think that this is the same debate that we had before, and I'll just stop here because I know we can keep
Did you want to clarify something, Imad?
Yeah, just for accuracy, because I only have 3 sentences. The origins of this article go back not to Mubarak, as Micheline said, but to Sadat himself.
To Sadat, excuse me, 70s, yes.
Yes, 70s, and then 80.
That's right.
The second issue, the article does not mention Islamic law at all. The article mentions the principles of the Sharia. And this is the reason, this dilution, it's diluted, and that's why the article has always, this particular article, has always gained support even among the church itself, the Coptic church in Egypt, that they didn't mind this article because it's very vague. Yes, they expressed that several times.
Okay, Mohammed, you're shaking your head.
Yeah,
Do you want to respond to this particular debate? Because I got Dan waiting.
I'm talking about
We'll
facts.
get to you at the end.
Yeah, I'm talking about facts.
Okay.
The church came, because the principles is totally different from, like Islamic law and penal code and so on.
Right.
It talks about general principles of the Sharia.
Right. Okay, Dan, and then we'll end with Mohammed.
It's interesting what Shadi said about Islamists and what they give up. I mean, it's true. When Ghanouchi, we saw this when he came to Washington, D.C., and he went around, and most of the criticism that he received, including at the presentation at Georgetown, was from Islamists who said, well, you've given up the ghost. I mean, what's left here? We don't have an Islamist party. It gets to what you were saying, Mohammed, about these basic differences and how many concessions you can make before what you have doesn't look like an Islamist party at all. It's an interesting point. But I would say that in terms of the Constitution 2012, if you look at the process by which it was passed, if you look at the effort to basically limit the voices that were involved and make sure that the left and the liberals were largely excluded, it was a very illegitimate process compared to the very fractious process of constitution making in Tunisia, which nearly broke down, but ultimately saved. And it's true that from the point of view of the secularists and the non-Islamists, they have certain residual fears, if much more than that. But they also have a Supreme Court now that is empowered to defend their interests. And so they've gotten certain basic agreements and basic rights, which I think in terms of the 2012 Constitution of Egypt are absent. That constitution may not be an Islamist constitution, but it is certainly a constitution in which rights, individual rights of many kinds, are still conditioned by the arbitrary exercise of power, including by the military. And I think that makes it a very authoritarian document.
Okay, final word to Mohammed, and then we'll break for lunch.
I just want to respond to one thing and that I forgot to respond to. It's not because it's for ego or anything, but because I think it is an important point that hasn't come up so far, and something that Ellis has actually mentioned in some of his writings. Some people said, oh, it's wrong to focus on the failures of the youth activists because they were the weakest link in the chain, so to speak. But that, I think, makes a mistake in looking at their strength vis-a-vis the entire population of the country, and not at the relevant place of the strength, namely in Cairo. The revolution in many ways is a story about urban politics. And also you have to look at the geography of the presidential palace. The presidential palace is in the heart of Masr al-Gadida, which was, Heliopolis, which was a precinct that has been very anti-Muslim Brotherhood throughout all the elections. So even though the Muslim Brotherhood position won in all 5 of the elections, I don't think they ever carried, even in the March 2011 referendum, they never carried that sector of the city. So the President Morsi was located in what you could say the most hostile area of the country toward his rule, right? And so what I would say is even if in absolute numbers, right, they weren't more than 20%, in Cairo, and in particularly in sort of politically important areas of the country, they were very strong. And in my opinion, if they had just said, okay, look, we've lost this round, but it's more important for us in the long term to preserve some kind of democratic system, maybe we will live to fight another day. Now they're in jail with Morsi. So.
Well, on that note, we've arrived at the lunch period. We will reconvene here at 3 o'clock. To the conference delegates, we're going to a nearby restaurant. There's going to be volunteers here to escort you there. And we'll see you all again at 3 o'clock for the third session. Thanks.